When I found the second phone hidden in my husband Porter's car, I expected to find evidence of an affair. Instead, I discovered text messages between him and his business partner Sam, planning my death for a $750,000 life insurance payout. The messages detailed everything: when to do it, how to make it look accidental, and how they'd split the money afterward. By the time I finished reading, I knew I had two choices: become their victim or become their worst nightmare. I chose the latter, and within 48 hours, both of their lives were destroyed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Let me tell you exactly how I discovered that the man I'd been married to for 6 years had been planning my murder. My name is Elizabeth Olivier, and 3 months ago, I thought I was living the perfect suburban life. I was a pediatric nurse at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, married to Porter Olivier, who ran a successful construction company with his partner Sam Myers. We had a beautiful house in Maple Glen, 2 cars, and what I believed was a loving marriage built on trust and mutual respect. I should have known something was wrong when Porter started working late every night, when he became obsessed with our financial planning, and when he kept insisting we needed to increase my life insurance policy. But love makes you blind to red flags, doesn't it? The discovery happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Porter had left for work earlier than usual, muttering something about meeting Sam at a job site in Norristown. He'd been increasingly stressed about their business, claiming they were behind on several major projects and facing potential bankruptcy. I was running late for my shift at the hospital when I realized I'd forgotten my phone charger in Porter's car. He'd taken my car to get the oil changed the day before, and we'd switched vehicles that morning. As I rushed to his black Ford F-150 parked in our driveway, I was already mentally preparing for the busy day ahead in the pediatric ICU. Porter's truck was always meticulously organized. He was almost obsessive about keeping it clean. Tools in their designated spots, paperwork filed in the glove compartment, not even a coffee cup left behind. That's why what I found was so shocking. I popped open the center console looking for my charger, and there it was, a small black iPhone I'd never seen before, tucked beneath some construction permits. Not Porter's regular phone, which was a newer model with a distinctive blue case that I'd bought him for his birthday. This was different, older, like a burner phone. My heart started racing immediately. The obvious thought hit me first: affair. After 6 years of marriage, was Porter cheating on me? The evidence seemed to point that way. Why else would someone hide a second phone? I powered it on, my hands trembling slightly. No passcode. That should have been my first clue that Porter wanted someone to find this phone eventually. The message history loaded, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The messages weren't with another woman. They were between Porter and Sam Myers, his business partner of 8 years, the man who'd been best man at our wedding, the man who came to our house for dinner every Sunday, the man I'd trusted completely. But these weren't business messages about construction projects or client meetings. These were messages about me, about my death, about life insurance money. The first message thread I opened was from 2 weeks earlier. Sam, insurance agent, confirmed the policy increase went through. $750K now. Porter, good. Elizabeth signed without asking questions. She trusts me completely. Sam, when are we doing this? Porter, soon. I'm working on the timing. Needs to look natural. I stared at the screen, reading those words over and over again. My husband, the man who kissed me goodbye every morning, who brought me coffee in bed on weekends, who held me when I had nightmares, was discussing my death like a business transaction. I scrolled up to see more messages, each one worse than the last. Porter, the hiking trail behind Valley Forge Park. Lots of cliffs, easy to stage an accident. Sam, what about witnesses? Porter, I'll make sure we go alone. I'll tell people she was being reckless, that I warned her about getting too close to the edge. Sam, you sure you can go through with this? Porter, it's $750,000, Sam. Split 2 ways. That's enough to save the business and start over somewhere else. My legs gave out. I sat down hard on the driveway, the phone clutched in my shaking hands. This wasn't just about money. They were planning my murder with the same attention to detail they'd use for a construction project. I kept reading, horrified, but unable to stop. Sam, What if the cops suspect something? Porter, they won't. I've been documenting her depressions for months, told her doctor she's been having mood swings, created a paper trail that she's been unstable. Sam, you're cold, man. Porter, I'm practical. This solves all our problems. The messages continued for weeks. They discussed different methods, car accidents, drowning, even poisoning, before settling on the hiking accident. Porter had been researching the insurance payout process, how long it would take to collect, and how to invest the money once they received it. But the message that broke me completely was the most recent one, sent just yesterday. Porter, taking her hiking this weekend. Weather's supposed to be foggy, perfect conditions. By Sunday night, this will all be over. Sam, are you sure about this? She's a good person, Porter. Porter, good people don't pay the bills, Sam. Dead people with life insurance policies do. I dropped the phone and vomited right there on the driveway. This man I'd shared a bed with for 6 years, who I'd nursed through pneumonia last winter, who claimed to love me more than life itself, was planning to push me off a cliff this weekend. The business struggles weren't financial, they were intentional. Porter had been sabotaging their projects, creating fake debts, and maneuvering their company toward bankruptcy to justify desperate measures. My death wasn't a last resort, it was the plan all along. Everything made sense now. Why he'd been so insistent about increasing my life insurance. Why he'd been suggesting hiking trips lately, always to dangerous locations. Why he'd been asking odd questions about my work schedule, my friendships, my family relationships. Porter had been grooming me for murder, and I'd been the perfect, trusting victim. But as I sat there on the cold driveway, holding the evidence of my husband's betrayal, something hardened inside me. I wasn't going to be anybody's victim. I was going to be their worst nightmare. I stood up, wiped my mouth, and looked at that phone one more time. Porter and Sam thought they were so clever, so careful. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated me. As I walked back into the house, I was no longer the trusting wife who'd woken up that morning. I was a woman who'd just discovered that her life was in immediate danger, and I had less than 5 days to save myself. The first thing I did was call in sick to work. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to turn this nightmare into justice. I made coffee with shaking hands and sat at our kitchen table, the same table where Porter had convinced me to sign those life insurance papers just 3 months ago. I remembered that conversation now with crystal clarity. He'd presented it as responsible financial planning, something every married couple should do. We need to protect each other, he'd said, holding my hand across this very table. If something happens to me, you'll be taken care of. And if something happens to you, he'd paused, looking so sincere, so loving. I want to make sure your family doesn't have to worry about funeral costs. Funeral costs. The bastard had been planning my funeral while I signed my own death warrant. I picked up the burner phone again, and screenshot every single message. I forwarded them to my personal email, then deleted the forwarded messages from the phone's sent folder. If Porter checked the phone, he'd see that someone had been through it, but he wouldn't know what they'd found or what they'd done with the information. Then I started researching. I looked up the hiking trail he'd mentioned. Valley Forge Park had indeed seen several hiking accidents over the years. Cliffs, unstable rock formations, easy for someone to slip and fall, the perfect place for a murder disguised as an accident. I also researched the life insurance policy. Porter was right. $750,000 was a substantial amount. But what he didn't know was that I'd been making payments on a separate policy through my work for years, one that he wasn't aware of. If I died, my sister Marianne would receive an additional $500,000. The irony wasn't lost on me. Porter was planning to kill me for money, never knowing that there was even more money he didn't know about. As I sat there in our kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together, I realized that everything had been a lie. Our marriage, his love, his concern for our future, it had all been performance art leading up to this moment. He'd been playing the role of loving husband while planning my murder, but I was done being the naive victim in someone else's story. It was time to become the author of my own ending. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd never thought I'd need. My friend Deborah Hahn from nursing school had become a criminal defense attorney, and she owed me a favor from when I'd helped her through her divorce last year. Deborah, I said when she answered, I need your help. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And I need you to not ask any questions until I explain everything. Elizabeth? What's wrong? I'm in danger, I interrupted. Immediate danger. Can you meet me somewhere private? Somewhere my husband won't think to look for me. There was a pause. Are you safe right now? For the moment, but not for long. Meet me at the Starbucks on Butler Pike in an hour. Come alone, and Elizabeth. Her voice was deadly serious. If you think you're in real danger, we're calling the police. I hung up and looked around our house one more time. This morning I'd been a happy wife getting ready for work. Now I was a woman preparing for war. I gathered a few essential items, my passport, some cash I kept in my jewelry box, and the burner phone with all its damning evidence. I also grabbed Porter's laptop from his home office. If he was planning my murder, there might be more evidence on his computer. Before leaving, I did something that might seem strange. I made the bed, washed our breakfast dishes, and tidied up the house. I wanted everything to appear normal when Porter came home. I wanted him to think his plan was still secret, that his trusting wife was still clueless about her impending doom. As I drove to meet Deborah, I thought about how Porter would react when he realized I'd discovered his plan. Would he try to accelerate the timeline? Would he panic and run? Or would he try to convince me that I'd misunderstood, that the messages meant something else entirely? It didn't matter. I had evidence now, I had proof, and I had something Porter had never counted on, the will to fight back. When I walked into that Starbucks, I wasn't just meeting my friend for coffee, I was taking the first step in a battle that would destroy Porter and Sam's lives just as completely as they'd planned to destroy mine. The only difference was that I was going to do it legally. Deborah Hahn had always been the most level-headed person I knew. Even in nursing school, when everyone else was panicking about exams or clinical rotations, Deborah remained calm and analytical. That's probably why she'd made such a successful transition from healthcare to law. When I walked into the Starbucks on Butler Pike, I found her sitting in a corner booth, already nursing a large coffee and studying my face with the same intensity she'd once used to assess patients. You look like hell, she said, without preamble as I slid into the booth across from her. When's the last time you slept? Last night, I replied, though it felt like a lifetime ago. But I don't think I'll be sleeping much for a while. Deborah leaned forward. Elizabeth, you sounded terrified on the phone. What's going on? I pulled out the burner phone and set it on the table between us. My husband is planning to kill me this weekend, and I have proof. To her credit, Deborah didn't laugh or look skeptical. She simply nodded and said, "Show me." I opened the message thread and handed her the phone. I watched her face as she read, saw her expression change from concern to horrified to furious. When she finished, she looked up at me with the same steely determination that had gotten her through law school while working 2 jobs. "This is attempted murder conspiracy," she said quietly, "and insurance fraud. How long has this been going on?" "Based on the messages, at least 2 months," I replied. "But I think it's been longer. I think Porter has been planning this since he convinced me to increase the life insurance policy." Deborah was already taking notes on her phone. "Tell me about the policy. When did you sign it? What were the circumstances?" I told her everything, how Porter had presented it as financial responsibility, how he'd scheduled the meeting with the insurance agent, how he'd been there for every signature. I told her about the business struggles that I now realized were fabricated, about the late nights he'd been spending with Sam Myers, about the subtle changes in his behavior over the past few months. "He's been documenting supposed mental health issues," I said, showing her another message thread, "telling people I've been depressed, unstable, creating a narrative that would explain why I might have an accident." Deborah's jaw tightened. "That's premeditation. He's been building this plan for months." She looked at me seriously. "Elizabeth, you need to understand something. If we take this to the police, there's no going back. Your marriage will be over. Porter will be arrested. This will become public." "My marriage was over the moment he decided to kill me," I said firmly. "I just didn't know it yet." Good, Deborah said, and I could see why she'd been so successful in criminal law. Because we're going to destroy him, both of them. She explained what would happen next. We'd need to involve law enforcement immediately, but we'd also need to be strategic. Porter couldn't know that I'd discovered his plan, or he might panic and either flee or accelerate his timeline. The hiking trip is this weekend, she asked. According to the messages, yes, Saturday morning. He's been talking about wanting to explore Valley Forge Park. We need to make sure that doesn't happen, Deborah said. But we also need to catch him in the act of planning it. Have you acted normally around him? I nodded. I called in sick to work so I could meet with you, but I told him I was coming down with something. He seemed pleased, actually. Probably thought a sick wife would be even easier to push off a cliff. Deborah made more notes. I'm going to call a colleague who specializes in insurance fraud. We'll also need to involve the FBI. This crosses state lines if he's planning to flee afterward. She paused. There's something else we need to consider. Porter's business partner, Sam Myers. He's equally culpable in this conspiracy. Sam's been like family to us, I said, the betrayal hitting me again. He was Porter's best man. I've known him for 8 years. 8 years of him watching Porter plan your murder, Deborah said bluntly. Don't waste sympathy on him, Elizabeth. He's a co-conspirator in an attempted murder plot. She was right. Sam had multiple opportunities to stop this, to warn me, to report Porter to the authorities. Instead, he'd helped plan my death, and looked forward to profiting from it. What about the business? I asked. Are they really in financial trouble? We'll need to investigate that too, Deborah said. But based on these messages, I suspect Porter has been sabotaging his own company to justify desperate measures. We'll need forensic accountants to trace the money trail. As we talked, I began to realize the scope of Porter's deception. This wasn't just about a struggling business or a desperate husband. This was about a man who'd systematically planned and orchestrated his wife's murder, while maintaining the facade of a loving marriage. There's something else, I said, remembering. I grabbed his laptop before I left the house. There might be more evidence on there. Deborah's eyes lit up. Good thinking. We'll need to turn that over to the authorities. But first, let's see what we're dealing with. We left the coffee shop and went to Deborah's law office, a modest but professional suite in a converted Victorian house in Ambler. She had her IT specialist, Tom Marks, come in to examine Porter's laptop without leaving digital footprints. What Tom found made the text messages look like child's play. Porter had been researching my death for months. Browser history showed searches for hiking accident statistics, life insurance payout timeframes, how to stage accidental death, and countries without extradition treaties. He'd researched poison, car accidents, drowning, and even house fires before settling on the hiking accident. But the most damning evidence was a detailed document titled Project EE for Elizabeth. It was a step-by-step plan for my murder, complete with timelines, alibis and financial projections. Porter had calculated exactly how much money he'd need to disappear after collecting the insurance payout, where he'd go, and how he'd establish a new identity. This is beyond premeditation, Tom said, his face pale. This is a detailed murder manual. The document included contingency plans for different scenarios, backup methods if the hiking accident didn't work, and strategies for deflecting suspicion. Porter had even planned what he'd wear to my funeral, what he'd say in his grief-stricken interviews with the media. He's been studying me, I said, reading through his observations about my habits, my fears, my weaknesses. Like a predator studying prey. That's exactly what he is, Deborah said grimly. And now we're going to turn him into the hunted. As we prepared to contact law enforcement, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. For the first time in my marriage, I knew more than Porter did. I had information he didn't know I possessed, and I had allies he didn't know existed. The man who'd been planning my death was about to discover that he'd married the wrong woman. What made Porter's betrayal even more devastating was how perfectly he'd woven himself into my family's life. My parents, Robert and Helen Olivier, had adored him from the moment I brought him home 6 years ago. My mother always said he was the son she never had, and my father respected his work ethic and business acumen. They'd welcomed him with open arms, never suspecting that their beloved son-in-law was planning their daughter's murder. But it was Porter's relationship with my sister Marianne that should have been the biggest red flag. Marianne Myers. Yes, she'd married Sam's younger brother Corey 2 years ago, making our betrayal even more twisted and complex. The two families had become intertwined through marriage, shared holidays, and business partnerships. Porter and Sam hadn't just been planning my murder, they'd been planning to destroy both families simultaneously. Marianne had always been protective of me, even though she was 3 years younger. She'd been the first to notice subtle changes in Porter's behavior over the past few months, though she'd attributed them to work stress rather than homicidal planning. He's been asking weird questions about you lately, she'd told me just last week when we'd met for lunch at our favorite cafe in Chestnut Hill. About your schedule, your habits, whether you ever go anywhere alone. I'd dismissed her concerns at the time. He's just being attentive, I'd said, completely missing the sinister undertone. He worries about me driving alone at night, you know how he is. But Marianne had pressed further. Elizabeth, he asked me if you ever go hiking alone. When I said no, he seemed disappointed. Who asks that kind of question? Now sitting in Deborah's office with the evidence of Porter's murder plot spread before me, I realized that Marianne had been seeing the predator that I'd been blind to. She'd sensed something wrong but hadn't been able to articulate exactly what it was. We need to bring your sister in on this, Deborah said, after I'd explained the family dynamics. If Porter suspects that you know, he might try to use her as leverage, or even as an alibi. The thought sent chills down my spine. What if Porter's plan involved hurting Marianne too? What if he'd been grooming her as his next victim, or worse, as an unwitting accomplice? I called Marianne using Deborah's office phone, keeping my voice as normal as possible. Hey, can you meet me at Deborah's office? I need to talk to you about something important. Is everything okay? Marianne's voice was immediately concerned. You sound strange. I'm fine, but I need you to come here without telling anyone where you're going. Especially don't tell Corey. There was a pause. Marianne knew that if I was asking her to keep secrets from her husband, something was seriously wrong. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While we waited, Tom continued analyzing Porter's laptop. What he found painted an even more disturbing picture of the family dynamics I'd thought I understood. Porter had been documenting not just my routines, but my entire family's patterns. He knew when my parents went to their book club meetings, when Marianne worked late at the veterinary clinic, when Corey traveled for his sales job. He'd been mapping our entire family's lives, looking for opportunities and vulnerabilities. Look at this, Tom said, showing us a spreadsheet titled Family Schedule Analysis. He's been tracking everyone's movements for months. Your parents' weekly routine, your sister's work schedule, even your nephew's soccer practice times. Why would he need to know about my nephew's soccer practice? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Because he's been planning for every contingency, Deborah said grimly. If your death raised suspicions, he'd need to know where everyone would be, how they'd react, who might cause problems for his story. The document revealed that Porter had been particularly interested in my relationship with Marianne. He'd noted that we talked on the phone every Tuesday, that we had lunch together every other Friday, that she was the person I was most likely to confide in if something was bothering me. He's been worried that you might tell your sister if you suspected anything, Tom observed. Look at this note. Im is Elizabeth's closest confidant, must monitor their conversations for signs of suspicion. When Marianne arrived, her face went pale as we explained the situation. She listened in stunned silence as Deborah showed her the evidence, the messages, the detailed planning documents. Corey doesn't know about any of this, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He can't know. Sam is his older brother, his business partner. This will destroy him. Marianne, I said gently, Corey is going to find out anyway. When we turn this evidence over to the FBI, both Porter and Sam will be arrested. There's no way to keep this quiet. She buried her face in her hands. 8 years of marriage, and I never suspected that Sam was capable of planning murder. What does that say about my judgment, about my ability to protect my own family? It says you're a normal person who trusts the people you love, Deborah said firmly. Psychopaths are skilled manipulators. They're good at appearing normal, even charming. That's how they get away with what they do. As we talked, I began to understand the full scope of the devastation Porter and Sam had planned. This wasn't just about my death, it was about the systematic destruction of two families who'd trusted them completely. There's something else, Marianne said hesitantly. Last month Sam asked me about your life insurance policy. He said he was thinking of increasing his own coverage, and wanted to know what company you used, what kind of policy you had. What did you tell him? I said I didn't know the details, but that Porter had mentioned you'd increased your coverage recently. I thought it was just casual conversation between brothers-in-law, but now we knew it was intelligence gathering. Sam had been helping Porter verify the details of the policy they planned to collect after my murder. He's been using me, Marianne said, the realization hitting her. All those friendly conversations, all those questions about you and your marriage. He's been gathering information to help plan your death. The betrayal was layered and complex. It wasn't just about Porter wanting to kill me for money, it was about two men who'd systematically infiltrated our family, gained our trust, and used that trust to plan the ultimate betrayal. We need to consider the possibility that there are other victims, Deborah said. Men who are capable of planning this kind of elaborate murder conspiracy don't usually start with their wives. There might be a pattern we don't know about. As we prepared to contact the FBI, I looked at my sister, the person who'd tried to warn me about Porter's strange behavior, who'd sensed something wrong even when I couldn't see it. I should have listened to you, I said. You couldn't have known, Marianne replied. But Elizabeth, promise me something. When this is over, when they're both in prison, promise me you'll never ignore your instincts again. I promised her that, but I also promised myself something else. I would make sure that Porter and Sam paid for every moment of fear they'd caused, every lie they'd told, every plan they'd made to destroy our family. The people who'd been planning to profit from my death were about to discover that they'd underestimated the strength of the family bonds they'd tried to exploit. The moment that changed everything happened at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and I remember it with perfect clarity because it was the last moment of my old life, the life where I trusted my husband completely and believed in the safety of our marriage. I'd been awake since 5:30, unable to sleep because of the thunderstorm that had been raging outside our bedroom window. Porter had slept through it peacefully, which should have been my first clue that something was different about him. The Porter I thought I knew was a light sleeper, who'd wake up if I so much as shifted positions in bed. But the Porter lying next to me that morning slept like a man without a conscience. He'd left for work unusually early, claiming he needed to meet Sam at a job site in King of Prussia before the crew arrived. Big inspection today, he'd said, kissing my forehead in that casual way that had once made me feel loved and protected. Might be late tonight, don't wait up. I should have questioned why he was going to a job site in the opposite direction of his usual projects. I should have wondered why he seemed almost eager to leave, why he'd been checking his phone constantly during breakfast, why he'd forgotten to take his usual travel mug of coffee. But I was running late for my own shift at the hospital, and I had other things on my mind. Mrs. Rodriguez in the pediatric ICU had been asking for me specifically, and I wanted to check on little Tommy Chen, who'd been admitted with pneumonia over the weekend. It wasn't until I was already in my scrubs, grabbing my stethoscope from the kitchen counter, that I realized I'd left my phone charger in Porter's truck. I'd been using it the night before to charge my phone in the living room, while we watched Netflix, and I'd absently carried it out to his truck when I'd helped him load some tools. The irony wasn't lost on me later. I was looking for a device to power my phone when I found the device that would destroy my marriage. Porter's black F-150 was parked in our driveway, still wet from the storm. He'd taken my Honda Civic because it got better gas mileage, he'd said, though I now know he'd taken it because he didn't want me to have access to his truck that day. I used my spare key to unlock the vehicle, the same key I'd used hundreds of times before when I'd needed to grab something from his truck or move it in the driveway. The truck smelled like Porter's cologne, and the coffee he'd spilled on the seat cushions last week, familiar scents that had once been comforting. I checked the center console first, thinking that's where I'd left the charger. Instead, I found construction permits, a pair of work gloves, and some loose change. I moved to the glove compartment, then checked under the seats. It was when I was reaching under the passenger seat, my hand searching blindly for the distinctive shape of my phone charger, that my fingers touched something that didn't belong there. The phone was wedged between the seat and the center console, hidden in a way that suggested it had been placed there deliberately. It was smaller than Porter's regular iPhone, older, with a cracked screen protector that he would never have tolerated on his main device. My first thought was that it must have fallen from someone's pocket, maybe one of the construction workers who occasionally rode with Porter to job sites. But when I powered it on, there was no lock screen, no passcode protection. The phone opened directly to the home screen, as if whoever owned it wanted it to be easily accessible. The message icon showed 47 unread texts. I told myself I was just going to check the contact list, to see if I could figure out who the phone belonged to so I could return it. That's the lie I told myself as I opened the messaging app, the justification I used to invade what I thought was a stranger's privacy. The truth was, something about finding a hidden phone in my husband's truck had triggered an instinct I'd been suppressing for months. The late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way Porter had been acting differently around me, all of it had been building toward this moment of discovery. When I saw Porter's name at the top of the contact list, my heart stopped. When I saw that the most recent message thread was between Porter and Sam, my hands started shaking. The preview of the latest message was visible without even opening the conversation, taking her hiking this weekend. Weather's supposed to be foggy, perfect conditions. By Sunday night, this will all be over. I stared at those words, reading them over and over again, my mind refusing to process what they meant. Taking her hiking, that had to be referring to me. We'd been planning a hiking trip to Valley Forge Park, something Porter had suggested just a few days earlier. By Sunday night, this will all be over. What would be over? I opened the message thread with fingers that could barely function. What I saw there shattered my world more completely than if I'd walked in on Porter with another woman. This wasn't about an affair, this was about murder. The messages laid out a plan so detailed, so coldly calculated, that I couldn't reconcile them with the man I'd shared a bed with for 6 years. They discussed my routines, my fears, my vulnerabilities. They analyzed the best locations for an accident, the optimal weather conditions, the most convincing narrative to tell investigators. But what broke me completely was the casual tone of the messages. They weren't discussing my death with reluctance or regret, they were discussing it like any other business transaction. Like planning a construction project or deciding where to go for lunch. Porter had written, "The hiking trail near the quarry has a 200-foot drop, easy to stage a slip and fall. I'll make sure she's wearing those new boots I bought her, the ones with the slippery soles." Those boots. The expensive hiking boots Porter had surprised me with last month, claiming he wanted me to be properly equipped for our outdoor adventures. I'd been touched by his thoughtfulness, never suspecting that he'd chosen them specifically because they would make me more likely to fall. Sam had replied, "You sure you can sell the grief? Cops are going to ask a lot of questions." And Porter's response, "I've been practicing. Watched some videos of grieving widowers online. I know exactly how to act." He'd been practicing. My husband had been practicing how to pretend to mourn my death while he planned my murder. I dropped the phone and ran to the side of the driveway, where I vomited into the storm drain. My legs gave out, and I sat there in the wet grass, the phone clutched in my trembling hands, as the reality of my situation crashed over me. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my life, was planning to kill me in 3 days. But as I sat there in the aftermath of that devastating discovery, something unexpected happened. Beneath the horror and betrayal, I felt something else beginning to take shape. Anger. Pure, cold, calculating anger. Porter thought he was so clever, so careful. But he'd made one crucial mistake. The first thing I did after finding the phone was something that probably saved my life. I took screenshots of every single message. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone steady, but I managed to capture all the evidence before my shock could overwhelm my survival instincts. The messages painted a picture of premeditated murder so detailed and cold-blooded that I had to read them multiple times before I could accept they were real. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of desperation. This was a carefully orchestrated business plan with my death as the desired outcome. The conversation thread started 3 months ago, right after I'd signed the increased life insurance policy. The first message was from Sam. She signed it. $750K confirmed. When do we move forward? Porter's response, not yet. Need to establish the right narrative first. Give me 2 months to set everything up. They'd been planning this for months. Every kiss, every I love you, every moment of intimacy we'd shared since then had been a lie. Porter had been playing the role of loving husband while calculating the exact value of my life. I scrolled through weeks of messages, each one more damning than the last. They'd considered different methods: drowning at the lake house, a car accident on the winding roads near Valley Forge, even staging a home invasion, before settling on the hiking accident. Hiking gives us the most control, Porter had written. I can choose the exact location, the exact timing, and Elizabeth loves hiking, so no one will question why we were there. Sam had been the voice of caution, repeatedly asking if Porter was certain he could go through with it. Once we do this, there's no going back. You sure you can kill your own wife? Porter's response haunted me. She's not my wife anymore. She's $750,000 in life insurance money. That's all she's ever been. But the message that truly revealed the depth of Porter's deception was one from 2 weeks ago. Took Elizabeth to scout the location yesterday. Told her we were just exploring new trails. She stood right at the edge of the cliff, completely trusting me. She has no idea how close she came to dying yesterday. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. Porter had been unusually attentive, taking photos of me near the cliff edge, encouraging me to get closer for better shots. He'd held my hand as we walked along the narrow trail, and I'd felt so loved, so protected by his presence. He'd been calculating the exact spot where he would push me to my death. The technical details of their plan were equally horrifying. They'd researched the investigation process, knew that hiking accidents were rarely treated as potential homicides, unless there was obvious evidence of foul play. They'd planned Porter's alibi down to the minute. He would slip while trying to save me, sustaining minor injuries that would support his story of a tragic accident. Make sure you get some scratches and bruises, Sam had advised. Nothing too serious, but enough to show you tried to help her. Already thought of that, Porter had replied. I'll scrape my hands on the rocks, maybe tear my shirt. Need to look like a hero who couldn't save his wife. They'd even discussed the funeral arrangements. Porter had researched the cheapest cremation options, claiming he wanted to honor Elizabeth's memory, while actually planning to maximize his profit from my death. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a message from just 2 days ago. Elizabeth's been acting strange lately, keeps asking questions about our finances, about the business. You think she suspects something? Sam's response. Doesn't matter. After Sunday she won't be asking any more questions. I realized with growing horror that Porter had been watching me, analyzing my behavior, looking for signs that I might be onto him. Every casual question I'd asked about our financial situation, every moment I'd seemed distracted or concerned, had been noted and reported to his co-conspirator. The final message in the thread was time-stamped just 6 hours ago. Weather forecast shows fog rolling in Saturday morning. Perfect conditions. I'll pick you up at 7 a.m. By Sunday night, we'll be rich men. Rich men. They were going to profit from my death, and consider themselves successful businessmen. I sat in that truck for 20 minutes, reading and rereading the messages, taking screenshots, forwarding them to my personal email address. The rain had started again, drumming against the windows, creating a cocoon of privacy that allowed me to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My marriage was a lie. My husband was a murderer, and I had less than 4 days to save my own life. But as I sat there surrounded by the evidence of Porter's betrayal, I felt something shift inside me. The shock was giving way to something harder, more focused. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman with information, with proof, with the element of surprise on my side. Porter thought he was the predator in this relationship, but he just handed me the tools to become the hunter. I carefully placed the phone back exactly where I'd found it, making sure it was positioned the same way, with the same amount of dust and debris around it. Porter couldn't know that I'd discovered his plan, not yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to turn his own weapon against him. As I walked back into our house, the house he'd planned to inherit after my death, I was no longer the trusting wife who'd left that morning. I was a woman who'd just been handed a glimpse into the mind of a killer. The messages I found on that burner phone weren't just evidence of a murder plot, they were a window into the soul of a monster I'd been sharing a bed with for 6 years. Each text thread revealed new layers of Porter's deception, and the casual tone of his communications with Sam made my blood run cold. The most devastating thread was labeled "Insurance Details" and contained weeks of correspondence about maximizing the payout from my death. Porter had researched everything: policy terms, investigation procedures, even the specific language he'd need to use when filing the claim. "Agent says accidental death triggers double indemnity clause," Porter had written. "That brings the total to $1.5 million instead of $750K. Worth the extra planning to make sure it looks completely accidental." Sam's response: "Jesus, Porter, that's real money. You sure she doesn't suspect anything? She's clueless. Last night she was talking about our retirement plans, how we'd travel Europe when we're older." I just smiled and nodded while calculating how much interest $1.5 million would earn in offshore accounts. Reading those words while sitting in the truck we'd bought together, in the driveway of the house we'd chosen together, was like being stabbed in the heart repeatedly. Every shared dream, every plan we'd made for our future, Porter had been silently mocking all of it while planning my murder. But the thread that truly revealed the depths of his psychological manipulation was titled "Behavior Modification." For months, Porter had been documenting my reactions to different situations, testing my responses, and carefully crafting scenarios to make me more vulnerable. "Convinced Elizabeth to start taking sleeping pills," one message read. "Told her the stress at work was affecting her sleep. She's been taking them for 2 weeks now. Should make the hiking trip easier, she'll be groggy, less alert to danger." Those sleeping pills. Porter had been so concerned about my insomnia, so caring in his suggestion that I see a doctor about it. He'd even made the appointment for me, driven me there, waited in the lobby while I discussed my sleep issues with Dr. Martinez. Dr. Martinez had been hesitant to prescribe medication, saying my sleep patterns seemed normal for someone with my work schedule. But Porter had been insistent, speaking to the doctor privately about my increasing anxiety and mood changes. Now I understood why he'd been so invested in my taking medication I didn't need. He'd been drugging me to make me easier to kill. Another message thread revealed how Porter had been manipulating our social circle to create the narrative he'd need after my death. He'd been having carefully orchestrated conversations with our friends and neighbors, planting seeds about my supposed mental health struggles. Told the Hendersons that Elizabeth's been having panic attacks. He'd written to Sam. Made sure to mention it when we were at their barbecue last weekend. "Jenny Henderson is the biggest gossip in the neighborhood. By now everyone thinks Elizabeth is unstable." "Good thinking," Sam had replied. "What about her family?" "Already handled. Been having private conversations with her parents about my concerns. They think I'm just being a caring husband, worried about his wife's well-being." I remembered those conversations now with horrifying clarity. Porter pulling my mother aside at family dinners, speaking to her in hushed tones about his worries. My father taking me aside afterward, gently asking if I was okay, and if I needed to talk to someone professional. I'd been confused by their concern, insisting I was fine, that I'd never felt better. But Porter had been systematically poisoning my family's perception of my mental state, creating a foundation for his story of a mentally unstable wife who'd tragically fallen to her death. The most chilling thread was simply titled "Practice Runs." Porter and Sam had been rehearsing different aspects of the murder plan, and their messages read like a twisted training manual. "Went to the trail yesterday to time the walk from parking lot to cliff," Porter had written. "Takes exactly 23 minutes. Gives us a clear window when no other hikers should be around." "Did you test the cell phone coverage?" Sam had asked. "Dead zone for about 100 yards around the cliff. Perfect for our needs. I'll make sure Elizabeth's phone is damaged in the falls, so they can't track our exact location or timing. They'd even practiced Porter's 911 call, with Sam playing the role of the emergency dispatcher. Porter had rehearsed his panicked husband routine, perfecting the right level of hysteria and grief. Remember to be breathless, Sam had advised. Like you just ran for help, and keep saying I tried to save her. That's important for the recording. Already got it down, Porter had replied. Practiced in the mirror this morning. Elizabeth was in the shower, so she didn't hear me rehearsing how I'd report her death. He'd been practicing my death scenario while I was getting ready for work, standing in our bedroom mirror and perfecting his performance as the grieving widower. But the message that finally broke my heart completely was the most recent one, sent just hours before I found the phone. Elizabeth made my favorite dinner last night. Pot roast with those little potatoes she does. She was so happy talking about maybe trying for kids next year. I almost felt bad for a second. Almost. Sam's response, "Don't get soft on me now. She's walking life insurance money, nothing more." Porter's reply, "You're right, just need to remember what's important. Sunday night we're rich, Monday morning we're free." Free. Porter saw my death as his freedom, not as the end of a life, not as the destruction of everything we'd built together. He saw it as a business transaction that would liberate him from the burden of being married to me. As I sat in that truck reading message after message of calculated betrayal, I realized that I'd never really known Porter at all. The man I'd married existed only in my imagination. The real Porter was a cold-blooded killer who'd been planning my death almost since the day he'd said I do. What I discovered next in Porter's messages made me realize that my murder wasn't just about insurance money. It was the culmination of a systematic campaign to erase me from existence, while maximizing his financial gain. The scope of his betrayal went far beyond what I'd initially imagined. Hidden in a thread labeled Asset Management were detailed discussions about how Porter and Sam planned to handle my death financially. They'd researched not just the life insurance payout, but every aspect of my financial life that would benefit them after I was gone. Elizabeth's 401k has $180,000, Porter had written. As beneficiary, I get all of it. Plus her teacher's pension fund survivor benefits will pay out monthly for life. We're looking at way more than just the insurance money. Sam had responded. What about her family? Won't they ask questions about the money? Already covered. I've been gradually isolating her from her parents and sister. By the time I collect, they'll be too grief-stricken to ask detailed questions about finances. And I'll play the devastated widower who can't bear to discuss money while mourning his beloved wife. The phrase gradually isolating her hit me like a physical blow. I thought back over the past year, remembering all the times Porter had discouraged me from spending time with my family. How he'd always seemed to have work emergencies whenever my parents visited. How he'd started arguments right before family gatherings, making me too upset to enjoy them. Your sister asks too many questions, he'd said, just last month when I'd mentioned having lunch with Marianne. She's always been jealous of what we have. Maybe it's better to keep some distance. I thought he was being protective. Instead, he'd been systematically cutting me off from the people who might notice changes in my behavior or question his story after my death. But the most horrifying discovery was a thread titled Backup Plans. Porter hadn't just planned one method of killing me, he'd developed multiple scenarios in case the hiking accident didn't work out. If the weather doesn't cooperate Saturday, we move to Plan B, he'd written. Elizabeth's been having those dizzy spells from the sleeping pills. Easy to stage a fall down the stairs at home. Can make it look like she hit her head. Those dizzy spells. I'd mentioned them to Porter a few times, worried that I might have an inner ear infection or blood pressure issues. He'd been so concerned, so attentive, suggesting I should see a doctor. Now I knew the dizziness was a side effect of the medication he'd manipulated me into taking, and he'd been planning to use it as a murder weapon. Plan C is the car accident, another message read. I've been loosening the lug nuts on her front wheel gradually. One more turn and they'll fail on the highway. Can time it for her drive to work when traffic is heavy. My blood ran cold. I'd been driving to work every day on a car that Porter had sabotaged, never knowing that each trip might be my last. The life insurance policy would pay out the same, whether I died in a hiking accident or a car crash. Porter had been creating multiple opportunities to collect. The messages revealed that Sam had been equally involved in the planning. He'd researched accident statistics, studied police investigation procedures, and even scouted locations for staging different types of accidents. Hospital parking garage has good sightlines, Sam had written. If the hiking thing doesn't work, we could stage a mugging gone wrong. Dark, isolated security cameras have blind spots. They'd mapped out my work schedule, my routines, my habits, looking for vulnerabilities they could exploit. They knew I usually walked to my car alone after night shifts, that I often worked late when we had critical patients, that I sometimes took shortcuts through poorly lit areas. But perhaps the most devastating thread was one where Porter discussed his plans for after my death. He'd already been researching new identities, offshore bank accounts, and countries with favorable extradition laws. Costa Rica looks promising, he'd written. No extradition treaty with the US, low cost of living, and they don't ask questions about large cash deposits. I could live like a king on $1.5 million down there. Sam had been planning to join him. What about the construction business? We'll sell it after collecting the insurance money. Tell everyone we can't bear to continue working here after the tragedy. People will understand why we need a fresh start. They'd been planning to fake grief over my death just long enough to collect the money and liquidate their assets, then disappear to start new lives in another country. My murder wasn't just about money, it was about their complete escape from the lives they'd built here. The final message in this thread was time-stamped just yesterday. Elizabeth asked me about our vacation plans for next summer. I told her we'd go to Italy, maybe rent a villa in Tuscany. She was so excited, started researching flights and hotels. I almost laughed. By next summer, she'll be dead and I'll be sipping drinks on a beach in Central America. Reading those words, I realized that every future plan I'd made, every dream I'd shared with Porter, had been met with secret amusement as he calculated how much money my death would provide for his new life without me. But as I sat in that truck, surrounded by evidence of months of planning for my murder, I felt something unexpected. Not just horror or fear, but a cold, calculating anger that matched Porter's own methodical approach. He'd been planning my death with the precision of a business strategy. Now it was time for me to plan his destruction with the same level of detail and calculation. Porter thought he was the mastermind in this scenario, but he'd just handed me the blueprint for his own downfall, and I was going to use every single piece of evidence to make sure he never hurt anyone again. The moment when everything truly clicked into place happened as I sat in Porter's truck, staring at a message thread I'd almost missed. It was buried deep in the phone's history, labeled simply research, and what I found there transformed my understanding of who I'd married from a calculating killer to something far more terrifying. Porter hadn't just been planning my murder, he'd been studying murder. The thread contained months of research into famous life insurance murder cases, detailed analysis of what had gone wrong in failed attempts, and methodical notes on how to avoid the mistakes that had led other killers to get caught. The Peterson case failed because he was too obvious about wanting the wife dead, Porter had written. Took out multiple policies, kept talking about life insurance. I've been more subtle, only one policy increase, spaced out over time, made it seem like Elizabeth's idea. Sam had responded, what about the Castor case? Stacy Castor's mistake was using poison. Too easy to detect in autopsy. Physical accidents are cleaner, less likely to trigger suspicious toxicology tests. They'd been studying these cases like textbooks, learning from other killers' failures to perfect their own plan. Porter had researched forensic science, police investigation procedures, and even the psychological profiles of successful murderers. But the message that made my blood run cold was one where Porter analyzed why some husbands got caught while others didn't. The key is timing and believability. The successful ones waited at least 2 years after taking out the policy, maintained loving relationships right up to the end, and chose methods that looked completely accidental. I've been patient. It's been 8 months since our policy increase. Elizabeth still thinks I adore her. The hiking accident will look like exactly what it is, a tragic slip and fall. 8 months. He'd been planning this for 8 months, and I'd been completely oblivious, playing the role of the loving wife in his murder plot without even knowing it. As I scrolled through more messages, I realized that Porter's research had gone beyond just planning my death. He'd been studying the psychology of grief, learning how to convincingly play the part of a devastated widower. Watched more grieving husband interviews on YouTube. He'd written key points, short, broken sentences when talking about her, refer to her in present tense initially, then catch myself and correct to past tense. Shows I'm still in denial about her death. Also important to mention specific memories, our first date, her laugh, little things that make it seem real, our first date. He'd been planning to exploit the memory of our first date, the night I'd fallen in love with him, as part of his performance to convince the world of his innocence after he murdered me. But the most chilling discovery was a message where Porter discussed the practice runs he'd been doing without Sam's knowledge. Been testing Elizabeth's reactions to dangerous situations, he'd written. Last week I suggested we go swimming in the quarry, despite the strong currents. She hesitated, but trusted me when I said it was safe. Good to know she'll follow my lead even when her instincts tell her something's wrong. I remembered that day with crystal clarity. The water at the quarry had looked rough, and I'd felt nervous about swimming there. But Porter had been so confident, so reassuring, that I'd ignored my gut feeling and followed him in. The current had been stronger than expected, and I'd struggled to swim back to shore. Porter had reached me just as I was starting to panic, pulling me to safety with what I'd thought was genuine concern. "I've got you," he'd said, holding me as I caught my breath. "I'd never let anything happen to you." But now I knew he'd been calculating whether I was weak enough to drown, whether the location was isolated enough for a murder, whether he could make it look accidental. He'd been testing my trust, my physical limitations, my survival instincts. "She's completely dependent on me in crisis situations," he'd continued in the message. "Never questions my judgment when we're in potential danger. The hiking accident will be perfect, she'll trust me right up to the moment I push her off the cliff." That phrase, "right up to the moment I push her off the cliff," hit me like a physical blow. Porter hadn't just been planning an accident, he'd been planning to look me in the eyes and murder me, while I trusted him completely. The final message in this thread was the most recent, sent just 2 days ago. "Everything is in place. Elizabeth has no idea what's coming. She's been taking the sleeping pills regularly, so she'll be groggy Saturday morning. The weather forecast is perfect. I've tested the location, practiced the 911 call, and established the right emotional baseline with friends and family. By Sunday night, Elizabeth Olivier will be dead, and I'll be $1.5 million richer." As I finished reading, I realized I was shaking, not from fear, but from rage. Porter had turned our entire relationship into a murder plot. Every kiss, every "I love you," every moment of intimacy had been part of his long-term strategy to kill me. But he'd made a crucial error. He'd documented everything so thoroughly that he'd created the perfect evidence trail for his own conviction. His obsession with planning the perfect murder had led him to create the perfect case against himself. I carefully placed the phone back exactly where I'd found it, my hands steady now with purpose. Porter thought he was the mastermind, the brilliant killer who'd studied every angle and planned every detail. But he'd forgotten one crucial factor in his calculations. He'd underestimated the intelligence and determination of his intended victim. I wasn't going to be the trusting wife who followed him to her death. I was going to be the woman who used his own evidence to destroy him before he could carry out his plan. The moment I replaced that phone in Porter's truck and walked back into our house, I knew I was entering enemy territory. Every room, every piece of furniture, every shared memory had been contaminated by the knowledge that the man I'd lived with for 6 years had been planning my murder with the methodical precision of a serial killer. I moved through our home like a spy in hostile territory, hyper-aware that Porter could return at any moment. The first thing I did was check the sleeping pills he'd manipulated me into taking. I dumped them down the toilet and refilled the bottle with over-the-counter antihistamines that looked similar. If Porter was monitoring my medication intake, and based on his messages, he'd see the pill count decreasing, but I'd no longer be drugged into the vulnerable state he'd planned. Next, I went to my car and checked the lug nuts on the front wheel. My hands shook as I examined them, and sure enough, I could see that they'd been loosened. Two of them were barely holding on. If I'd driven to work that morning, I might never have made it to the hospital alive. Using Porter's own tools from the garage, I tightened the lug nuts back to safety. But I also did something else. I took photos of the loosened bolts, documenting the evidence of his attempted murder. Porter's meticulous planning was about to become his downfall. I had to make a choice in that moment. I could call the police immediately, turn over the evidence, and hope that the justice system would protect me. But Porter was smart, careful, and had been planning this for months. He might have contingencies I hadn't discovered yet, ways to discredit me or escape if he suspected I knew about his plan. Instead, I decided to be just as strategic and methodical as he'd been. I was going to build an unshakable case against him before he even knew he was being investigated. I called my supervisor at the hospital and told her I had a family emergency and needed to take a few days off. Then I called my sister Marianne, but I was careful about what I said over the phone. For all I knew, Porter had been monitoring my calls too. "Marianne, I need to see you right away," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Can you meet me at the Starbucks on Butler Pike? It's important." "Elizabeth, you sound strange. Is everything okay? I can't talk about it over the phone. Just meet me there in an hour, and don't tell anyone where you're going." Not even Corey. I packed a small bag with essential items, documents, some cash, a change of clothes, and hid it in my car. If Porter's plan accelerated, if he sensed that I knew something, I might need to disappear quickly. But before I left the house, I did something that probably saved my life. I went to Porter's home office and copied everything I could find onto a flash drive. Financial documents, insurance papers, business records, anything that might contain evidence of his planning or show his true financial motivations. What I found in his computer files confirmed my worst fears. Porter had been living a double life for months, possibly years. There were folders labeled E-Project that contained detailed surveillance notes about my daily routines, my work schedule, my relationships with colleagues and friends. He'd been tracking my movements like a stalker, noting things like Elizabeth usually parks in the same spot at the hospital section C, near the emergency exit, and she takes the stairs instead of the elevator when working late shifts. Good opportunity for staged accident. But the most disturbing discovery was a folder labeled Practice Scenarios. Porter had been creating detailed written accounts of different ways to kill me, almost like creative writing exercises. He'd written elaborate stories about car accidents, drowning incidents, and hiking mishaps, complete with dialogue he'd use when calling 911, and descriptions of how he'd behave at the scene. One document, titled Valley Forge Scenario Final Draft, read like a movie script. Porter had written out every detail of Saturday's planned murder, including the exact words he'd use to convince me to walk to the cliff edge, the angle he'd push me from to ensure a fatal fall, and his step-by-step response afterward. "Elizabeth will be groggy from the sleeping pills," he'd written. "I'll suggest we sit on the rock outcropping to rest. When she's positioned correctly, I'll create a distraction, maybe point to something in the distance. While she's looking away, I'll push her from behind. The fall is 200 feet onto rocky ground, survivability is 0%. 0% survivability. Porter had calculated the exact physics of my death and determined that there was no chance I'd survive his attack. As I read through document after document of his planning, I realized that I wasn't just dealing with a husband who wanted to collect on my life insurance. I was dealing with someone who had turned murder into an art form, someone who took intellectual pride in creating the perfect crime. But Porter had made one crucial error in his meticulous planning. He'd documented everything so thoroughly that he'd created a complete confession to premeditated murder. His obsession with details, his need to plan every contingency, had led him to create the evidence that would convict him. I copied everything onto multiple flash drives, then uploaded backups to a secure cloud storage account that Porter didn't know about. I also wrote a detailed summary of everything I'd discovered and saved it in multiple locations. If something happened to me before I could get help, if Porter somehow discovered that I knew about his plan, this evidence would ensure that he didn't get away with my murder. But I wasn't planning to become his victim. I was planning to become his worst nightmare. As I drove to meet Marianne, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, complete clarity about what I needed to do. Porter thought he was the predator in this relationship, but he just armed his prey with everything she needed to destroy him. When I walked into that Starbucks to meet Marianne, I wasn't just meeting my sister, I was taking the first step in building a legal army that would destroy Porter before he could carry out his plan. But I knew I had to be careful about how I presented the information. What I'd discovered was so shocking, so unbelievable, that I needed to lay the groundwork carefully. Marianne took one look at my face and immediately stood up. "Elizabeth, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I need you to listen to everything I'm about to tell you without interrupting," I said, sliding into the booth across from her. "And I need you to promise me that no matter how insane it sounds, you won't dismiss it." I handed her one of the flash drives I'd prepared. "Everything I'm about to tell you is on there. But I want you to hear it from me first." Over the next 20 minutes, I laid out the entire conspiracy. The hidden phone, the messages between Porter and Sam, the murder plans, the sabotaged car, the months of manipulation and drug administration. I watched Marianne's face change from confusion to horror to fury, as I described how the two men our family had trusted had been planning my death. "Show me," she said, when I finished. Her voice was deadly calm, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult cases at the veterinary clinic. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screenshots of the messages. I watched her read through them, her expression growing darker with each revelation. "This is attempted murder," she said finally. "Elizabeth, we need to call the police right now." "We will, but not yet," I said. "I need to be strategic about this. Porter is smart, and he's been planning this for months. If we move too quickly, he might find a way to escape or discredit the evidence." "What do you mean?" I explained my plan. "I need to contact Deborah Hahn first. She's a criminal defense attorney now, and she'll know how to handle this properly. We need to build an unshakable case before Porter even knows he's being investigated." Marianne nodded slowly. "You're right. If he suspects you know, he might try to accelerate his timeline or disappear." "Exactly. And there's something else we need to consider. Sam is married to Corey. This is going to destroy your husband's life too." Marianne's face crumpled slightly. "Corey has no idea what his brother is planning. He thinks Sam is just helping Porter with business problems. How am I supposed to tell him that his brother is planning to murder his sister-in-law?" "We'll figure that out," I said. "But right now I need to know, are you with me on this? Because once we start this process, there's no going back." "Of course I'm with you," she said fiercely. "Porter and Sam have been planning to murder my sister. I don't care if it destroys both our marriages, they're not getting away with this." I called Deborah from the coffee shop, using the same careful language I'd used with Marianne. "I need to see you immediately. It's about Porter, and it's serious." "How serious?" Deborah asked. "Life and death serious. Can you meet me at your office in an hour? I'll be there." While we waited, Marianne and I discussed the practical implications of what we were about to do. "Porter will be home from work around 6, I said. "I need to act completely normal around him. If he suspects anything, he might try to move up the timeline." "What about the hiking trip on Saturday?" Marianne asked. "You can't go. I know. But I can't just refuse without arousing suspicion. I need to find a way to avoid it that won't make him think I know about his plan." "What if you got called in for an emergency at the hospital?" "That could work, but I'd need someone to back up the story. I'll call you Saturday morning with a fake emergency about one of my patients. You can tell Porter you need to help me with a difficult case." As we drove to Deborah's office, I felt the weight of what we were about to set in motion. This wasn't just about saving my life, it was about exposing a conspiracy that would destroy two families and send two men to prison for the rest of their lives. But as we walked into Deborah's law office, I also felt something else, the absolute certainty that I was doing the right thing. Porter had made his choice when he decided to plan my murder. Now I was making mine. Deborah listened to our story with the same professional calm she'd shown in nursing school during medical emergencies. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me seriously. "Elizabeth, What you're describing is not just attempted murder, it's a conspiracy involving multiple felonies. Insurance fraud, attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and possibly other charges we haven't identified yet. What's our next step? I asked. We need to involve law enforcement immediately, but we need to do it strategically. I'm going to contact the FBI. This crosses state lines if Porter's planning to flee the country, which makes it a federal case. The FBI, Marianne looked shocked. Porter has been planning this for months, Deborah explained. He's researched similar cases, he's planned escape routes, he's methodically documented his intentions. This isn't a crime of passion, it's a calculated conspiracy. The FBI has resources that local police don't have. What about protecting Elizabeth? Marianne asked. The murder is planned for Saturday. That's in 4 days. We're going to make sure Saturday never happens, Deborah said firmly. By tomorrow night Porter and Sam will be in federal custody. As we left Deborah's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Porter thought he was the mastermind, the brilliant killer who'd planned the perfect crime. But he'd forgotten one crucial factor. He'd underestimated the intelligence and determination of the woman he'd planned to murder, and now she was building a team that would make sure he never hurt anyone again. The FBI field office in Philadelphia was nothing like what I'd imagined from watching crime shows on television. Special Agent Sarah Martinez was a composed woman in her 40s, who listened to our story with the kind of professional intensity that made me understand why Deborah had insisted on federal involvement. Mrs. Olivier, Agent Martinez said, after reviewing all the evidence we'd brought, the screenshots, the flash drives, the documentation of Porter's planning, what you've uncovered is one of the most thoroughly documented murder conspiracies I've seen in 15 years with the Bureau. She spread the printed messages across her desk like pieces of a puzzle. Your husband has essentially created a complete confession to premeditated murder. Every text message, every document on his computer, every piece of planning, it's all admissible evidence that shows clear intent to commit murder for financial gain. What happens now? I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. We're going to set up a controlled operation, Agent Martinez explained. We need to arrest both Porter and Sam simultaneously to prevent either one from destroying evidence or fleeing. Based on their messages, they're planning to meet Friday night to finalize the details for Saturday's murder. Friday night, my stomach dropped. That's tomorrow. Which gives us exactly the window we need, she continued. We're going to let them think their plan is proceeding normally while we gather additional evidence and prepare for the arrests. Agent Martinez explained that they'd been monitoring similar cases involving life insurance fraud, and that Porter's methodology matched patterns they'd seen before. Men like your husband often don't stop with one victim, she said. We're going to investigate whether there are other cases, other potential victims. The thought that Porter might have done this before, that I might not be his first intended victim, made my blood run cold. What about my safety? I asked. I have to go home tonight and act normal around him. What if he suspects something? We're going to have surveillance teams monitoring your house starting immediately, Agent Martinez assured me. You won't be alone. We'll also have agents positioned near your workplace and anywhere else you might go. She handed me a small device that looked like a car key fob. This is a panic button. If you feel threatened at any point, press this, and we'll have agents at your location within minutes. What about Sam? Marianne asked. He's married to my husband. Corey has no idea what his brother is planning. We'll handle that carefully, Agent Martinez said. We may need to bring your husband in for questioning as well, but based on what you've told us, he appears to be unaware of the conspiracy. Over the next 2 hours, we went through every piece of evidence in detail. The FBI had forensic accountants who would examine Porter's financial records, computer specialists who would analyze his digital communications, and behavioral analysts who would create a profile of his psychological state. The level of planning your husband has engaged in is extraordinary, Agent Martinez said. He's researched similar cases, studied forensic science, practiced his emotional responses. This isn't the work of someone who snapped. This is someone who has turned murder into a systematic process. She showed us a timeline they'd created, based on Porter's messages. He's been planning your death since the day after you signed the increased life insurance policy. Every interaction you've had with him since then has been calculated to further his ultimate goal. What about the sleeping pills? I asked. He's been drugging me to make me more vulnerable. That's assault with intent to commit murder, Agent Martinez said. It's another felony charge that shows premeditation and ongoing harm. The most disturbing revelation came when they analyzed Porter's computer files. He's been researching your medical history, your family history, even your psychological profile, Agent Martinez explained. He's created a detailed analysis of your personality, your fears, your trust patterns, everything he'd need to manipulate you into a vulnerable situation. It's like he's been treating me as a research subject, I said, feeling sick. That's exactly what he's been doing. Your husband has approached your murder with the same methodical planning he'd use for a business project. But the FBI had also discovered something that gave me hope. Porter's obsession with documentation is going to be his downfall, Agent Martinez said. Criminals who keep detailed records of their planning almost always get convicted. He's created so much evidence against himself that there's no way he can claim this was anything other than premeditated murder. As we prepared to leave, Agent Martinez gave me specific instructions for the next 24 hours. Go home, act completely normal. Don't change your routine, don't seem suspicious or withdrawn. We need Porter to believe that everything is proceeding according to his plan. What if he tries to move up the timeline? I asked. We'll be watching. The moment he deviates from his planned schedule, we'll move in. And if something goes wrong, Mrs. Olivier, Agent Martinez said, looking me directly in the eyes, I promise you that Porter will not get the chance to hurt you. We're going to end this before Saturday ever arrives. As I walked out of the FBI building, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the absolute certainty that I was going to survive this. Porter had spent months planning my death, but now the full weight of the federal government was planning his arrest. The predator was about to become the prey, and he had no idea that his perfect plan was about to become his perfect downfall. Going home that evening, knowing what I knew about Porter while pretending everything was normal, was the most terrifying performance of my life. When I walked through our front door at 6:30 p.m., Porter was in the kitchen making dinner, my favorite pasta dish with homemade sauce, the same meal he'd made for our first anniversary. Hey beautiful, he said, kissing my cheek as I set down my purse. How was your day? Fine, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady, just tired, long shift at the hospital. But as I watched him move around our kitchen, chopping vegetables with the same knife he'd probably fantasized about using to stage my death, I realized that the FBI investigation had revealed something even more disturbing than I'd initially understood. Porter wasn't just planning to kill me, he was enjoying it. While I'd been at the FBI office, Agent Martinez had called with additional findings from their preliminary investigation. Porter's internet search history revealed a pattern of behavior that suggested he'd been fantasizing about murder for months, possibly years. We found searches dating back 2 years, Agent Martinez had said over the phone. He's been researching famous murder cases, studying forensic science, even visiting online forums where people discuss theoretical ways to commit perfect crimes. The searches weren't recent or sudden, they showed a gradual escalation of interest in murder that had culminated in the detailed planning of my death. Porter had been preparing for this moment long before he'd ever mentioned increasing my life insurance policy. There's something else, Agent Martinez had continued. We found evidence that he's been documenting your daily routines for over a year. Photos of you leaving for work, notes about your schedule, even recordings of your phone conversations with your family. As I sat across from Porter at our dinner table, making small talk about our days, I realized that every moment of our marriage had been a lie. He'd been studying me like a lab rat, collecting data that would help him murder me more efficiently. I was thinking about our hiking trip this weekend, Porter said, twirling pasta around his fork. The weather forecast looks perfect, cool in the morning, clear skies. That sounds nice, I replied, fighting the urge to vomit. He was discussing the weather conditions for my murder while serving me dinner on our wedding china. I found this great trail that's supposed to have amazing views, he continued. It's a bit challenging, but I think you can handle it. We'll just need to be careful near the cliff areas. Careful near the cliff areas. The cliff where he was planning to push me to my death in less than 48 hours. Are you okay? Porter asked, noticing that I'd stopped eating. You seem distracted. Just tired, I said. Maybe I should go to bed early. Good idea. You'll need your energy for Saturday. As I got ready for bed, I could hear Porter in his office, presumably coordinating final details with Sam. The FBI had placed listening devices in our house during the afternoon, and I knew that every word Porter spoke was being recorded as evidence. Agent Martinez had explained that they needed to let Porter's plan proceed until the last possible moment to ensure they had complete evidence of his intent. We need him to believe he's going through with it, she'd said. The more he commits to the plan, the stronger our case becomes. But lying in bed next to a man who was planning my murder while FBI agents listened from surveillance vans outside our house felt surreal. Porter fell asleep easily, as if planning someone's death was just another item on his to-do list. I stared at the ceiling, knowing that this was probably the last night I'd ever spend in this house, the last night I'd ever have to pretend that my marriage was real. The next morning, Porter was unusually attentive. He made breakfast, brought me coffee in bed, and seemed almost excited about something. I realized he was anticipating the completion of his plan. In 24 hours, he expected to be a widower with $1.5 million in life insurance money. I love you, he said as he kissed me goodbye. Tomorrow is going to be a perfect day. A perfect day for murder, he meant. After he left for work, Agent Martinez called with an update. We've been monitoring Sam's communications as well. They're planning to meet tonight at 9 p.m. to go over final details. That's when we'll move in. What about Porter? I asked. Won't he be suspicious when Sam doesn't show up for the hiking trip? He'll be in custody too. We're arresting them simultaneously, and if something goes wrong, Mrs. Olivier, I need you to trust us. We've handled cases like this before. By tomorrow morning, Porter will be in federal custody, and you'll be safe. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mixture of relief and terror. In 12 hours, this nightmare would be over. Porter would be arrested, his plan would be exposed, and I'd finally be free from the man who'd been planning my death while pretending to love me. But first I had to survive one more day of living with a killer who had no idea that his perfect plan was about to become his perfect downfall. Friday, October 15th was supposed to be the last day of my life according to Porter's plan. He'd scheduled our final meeting with Sam for 9 p.m. that night to review every detail of Saturday's murder. What he didn't know was that FBI agents had been monitoring his every move for the past 24 hours, and his perfect plan was about to become the evidence that would put him away for life. I woke up that morning to find Porter already dressed and unusually energetic. He was humming while he made coffee, checking his phone constantly, and seemed almost giddy with anticipation. Big day today, he said when he noticed me watching him. Sam and I are meeting tonight to finalize the details for our hiking trip tomorrow. I want everything to be perfect. Perfect. He was using that word again, the same word he'd used to describe the weather conditions for my murder, the same word he'd used to describe the cliff location where he planned to push me to my death. Are you excited about the hike? He asked, sitting down beside me with his coffee. Of course, I managed, though the words felt like glass in my throat. It'll be nice to get out in nature. You might want to wear those new boots I bought you, he suggested. The trail can be slippery in some places. The boots with the deliberately compromised soles that he'd designed to make me fall. Every suggestion, every caring gesture, every moment of apparent concern had been calculated to make my murder easier to execute. After Porter left for work, Agent Martinez called with the final details of the evening's operation. We've been monitoring Porter's communications all morning, she said. He's sent Sam at least a dozen messages confirming tonight's meeting. He's also been researching weather conditions for tomorrow and reviewing his planned route to the hiking trail. He's still planning to go through with it. Absolutely. He has no idea we're onto him. As far as he knows, everything is proceeding exactly according to his timeline. Agent Martinez explained that they'd set up a sophisticated surveillance operation for Porter and Sam's meeting. We're going to let them discuss their plans in detail. The more they commit to the murder plot on tape, the stronger our case becomes. Where are they meeting? Sam's construction office. Porter chose it because it's private, and Sam has access after hours. What he doesn't know is that we installed listening devices throughout the building yesterday. The irony wasn't lost on me. Porter had chosen the location for his final murder planning session specifically because he thought it would be private and secure. Instead, he'd chosen the perfect place for the FBI to record his confession. What about me? I asked. Do I need to do anything special tonight? Act completely normal. Porter will probably be home late from his meeting with Sam. When he gets home, he'll likely want to discuss final details about tomorrow's hiking trip. Let him talk. The more he reveals about his plans, the more evidence we have. At 3 p.m., Porter called me at home. Hey honey, I might be late tonight. Sam and I have a lot to discuss about tomorrow's logistics. That's fine, I said. I'll probably go to bed early anyway. Good idea. You'll need your rest for tomorrow's adventure. He was calling my planned murder an adventure. As evening approached, I found myself pacing around our house, knowing that FBI agents were positioned throughout our neighborhood, that Porter's every word was being recorded, that this nightmare was finally coming to an end. At 8:45 p.m., I watched from our bedroom window as Porter got into his truck and drove away. I knew he was heading to what he thought was a final planning session with Sam, but what was actually going to be his arrest. Agent Martinez had given me a secure phone to monitor the operation. At 9:15 p.m., she sent me a text, subjects in position, recording in progress. I could barely breathe knowing that in that moment, Porter was probably reviewing the exact details of how he planned to kill me. The timing, the location, the method, everything he'd been planning for months was being discussed and recorded as evidence. At 9:47 p.m., another text, subjects have confirmed murder plan for tomorrow morning, discussing alibis and post-murder procedures. Porter was so confident in his plan that he was discussing what he'd do after I was dead, how he'd act at the scene, what he'd tell investigators, how he'd behave at my funeral. At 10:23 p.m., the text I'd been waiting for. Moving in now. Arrests in progress. I sat in our living room, staring at that message, knowing that at that exact moment, FBI agents were surrounding the building where Porter thought he was safely planning my murder. I imagined his face when he realized that his perfect plan had been discovered, that his months of careful planning had been turned into evidence against him. At 10:45 p.m., Agent Martinez called. Mrs. Olivier, it's over. Porter and Sam are both in custody. You're safe. I sat in the silence of our house, the house Porter had expected to inherit after my death, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months, the absolute certainty that I was going to live to see another day. The predator had walked directly into the trap, and he had no idea that his perfect plan had just become his perfect downfall. The call from Agent Martinez came at 10:45 p.m., and her voice carried a satisfaction that I'd never heard before. Mrs. Olivier, it's over. Porter and Sam are both in custody. You're safe. I sat in stunned silence for a moment, processing words I'd been desperate to hear. It's really over. Completely over. We have everything we need. Porter spent 45 minutes detailing exactly how he planned to kill you tomorrow morning. Every word was recorded. Agent Martinez explained what had happened at Sam's construction office. They arrived at 9 p.m. as planned and immediately began reviewing their murder plot. Porter brought printed maps of the hiking trail, photos of the cliff location, and even a timeline of exactly when and how he planned to push you to your death. What did they say? Everything. Porter walked Sam through the entire plan step by step. He discussed how he'd get you to the cliff edge, the exact angle he'd push you from, how he'd stage the scene afterward. Sam asked questions about alibis, about how they'd split the insurance money, about their escape plans. The FBI had recorded over an hour of conversation between Porter and Sam, during which they'd discussed not just my murder, but their plans for afterward. Porter was already planning how he'd spend the life insurance money, Agent Martinez said. He'd researched property in Costa Rica, planned his new identity, even discussed what he'd tell people about needing to leave the country to heal from his grief. How did they react when you arrested them? Porter was shocked. He kept saying it was impossible, that no one knew about their plan. Sam tried to claim he was just humoring Porter, that he never intended to go through with it. But we have hours of recorded conversations proving otherwise. Agent Martinez explained that both men had been charged with conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and multiple other felonies. Based on the evidence we've gathered, Porter is looking at life in prison without parole. Sam will likely get 25 to life. What happens now? You're free to resume your normal life. Porter will be held without bail pending trial. The evidence against him is so overwhelming that his attorney will likely advise him to plead guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. As I hung up the phone, I walked through our house, the house Porter had expected to inherit after my death, and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete safety. The man who'd been planning my murder while kissing me goodnight, who'd been calculating the value of my life while making me breakfast, who'd been practicing his grief performance while I slept beside him, was now sitting in a federal holding cell where he belonged. I went to our bedroom and packed a bag. I wouldn't be spending another night in this house, in this bed, surrounded by the remnants of a marriage that had been built on lies and sustained by murder plans. As I walked out the front door for the last time, I thought about Porter sitting in his cell, probably still trying to figure out how his perfect plan had been discovered. He'd spent months planning my death, but he'd forgotten one crucial detail: the woman he'd underestimated was stronger, smarter, and more determined than he'd ever imagined. The hunter had become the hunted, and justice had finally been served. The trial of Porter Olivier and Sam Myers became a media sensation that dominated Philadelphia news for weeks. "Teacher's husband plots murder for insurance money" was the headline that followed me everywhere, but I didn't care about the publicity. I cared about justice. Sitting in that courtroom watching Porter in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't expected. This was the man who'd kissed me goodbye while planning my death, who'd made me breakfast while calculating my life insurance value, who'd practiced his grief performance in our bedroom mirror. The prosecution's case was devastating. They played hours of recorded conversations between Porter and Sam, detailing every aspect of their murder plot. The jury listened in horrified silence, as Porter's voice described exactly how he planned to push me off the cliff, how he'd stage the scene afterward, how he'd collect the insurance money. The defendant spent 45 minutes describing how he would kill his wife, the prosecutor said. He discussed the angle of the push, the staging of the scene, and how he would perform grief for investigators. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was calculated, premeditated murder. Porter's defense attorney tried to claim temporary insanity, arguing that financial stress had driven him to desperate thoughts he never would have acted upon. But the evidence was overwhelming. Months of planning, detailed documentation, systematic manipulation of my medication and behavior, none of it supported a claim of temporary anything. The most damning evidence came from Porter's own computer files. The prosecution displayed his e-project folders, his murder scenario scripts, his research into similar cases. The jury saw screenshots of his searches for undetectable poisons, staging accident scenes, and life insurance investigation procedures. Sam tried to distance himself from Porter, claiming he'd been coerced into participating. But the recorded conversations showed him actively contributing to the planning, asking detailed questions about timing and alibis, and expressing excitement about splitting the insurance money. When I gave my victim impact statement, I looked directly at Porter. "You didn't just plan to kill me," I said. "You killed the person I used to be, the person who trusted blindly, who believed in the sanctity of marriage, who thought love was enough. But you also gave me something unexpected, the knowledge that I'm stronger than I ever imagined." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Porter was convicted on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, attempted murder, and aggravated assault. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Sam received 25 years to life. As the judge read the sentences, I felt a chapter of my life finally closing. The man who'd planned my death was now facing his own life sentence, and I was finally free to rebuild the life he'd tried to steal from me. The day I gave my victim impact statement was the first time I'd seen Porter since his arrest 3 months earlier. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of his crimes. But as I walked to the podium in that packed courtroom, I felt taller, stronger, more powerful than I'd ever felt in my life. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and clear, "I want to tell you about the woman Porter Olivier planned to murder. She was a pediatric nurse who devoted her life to caring for sick children. She trusted completely, loved unconditionally, and believed that marriage was a sacred bond between two people who promised to protect each other." I looked directly at Porter as I spoke, watching his face for any sign of remorse or recognition of what he'd done. There was none. "That woman died the day I found the phone in Porter's truck. She died when I read his messages planning my murder. She died when I realized that every kiss, every I love you, every moment of intimacy we'd shared had been a performance while he calculated the exact value of my life." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my voice carrying across the room. I could see members of the jury wiping away tears, but Porter's expression remained blank, almost bored. "Porter didn't just plan to kill me for money," I continued. "He systematically destroyed my ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe in love. He drugged me with unnecessary medication to make me more vulnerable. He sabotaged my car to create opportunities for accidents. He isolated me from my family and friends so no one would question his story when I died." I paused, letting the weight of his betrayal settle over the courtroom. But here's what Porter didn't count on. His obsession with planning the perfect murder led him to document everything. His need to control every detail of my death became the evidence that saved my life and will keep him in prison for the rest of his. I turned to face the judge directly. "Your Honor, I'm not asking for vengeance. I'm asking for justice. Not just for me, but for every woman who might have become Porter's next victim. Because men like him don't stop with one murder, they perfect their methods and find new targets. The woman Porter planned to kill is gone forever," I concluded. "But the woman who survived his betrayal is stronger, wiser, and more determined than he ever imagined. I've rebuilt my life from the ashes of his deception, and I want him to spend the rest of his life knowing that his perfect plan created his perfect downfall." As I returned to my seat, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: complete closure. Porter's fate was sealed, and mine was finally my own to determine. 2 years have passed since Porter's sentencing, and I'm writing this from my new apartment in Center City, Philadelphia, a place Porter never knew existed, filled with furniture he never touched, in a neighborhood where no one knows my story, unless I choose to share it. I kept my maiden name when I divorced him while he was in prison. Elizabeth Olivier is gone forever, but Elizabeth Martinez, I chose to honor Agent Martinez by taking her name, is someone I'm proud to be. She's cautious but not paranoid, trusting but not naive, strong because she's been tested in ways most people never are. The life insurance policy that Porter wanted to cash in on my death, I donated that money to a foundation that helps victims of domestic violence and attempted murder. The house where we lived, I sold it and used the proceeds to fund a scholarship for nursing students who've overcome trauma. I still work as a pediatric nurse, though at a different hospital now. Children have a way of reminding you that trust, when given to the right people, is still a beautiful thing. They don't know about Porter or the trial or the headlines. They just know that I'm the nurse who stays late when they're scared, who holds their hand during procedures, who believes in their strength even when they don't. Marianne and I are closer than ever. Corey eventually divorced Sam after the trial, unable to reconcile the brother he'd loved with the man who'd planned his sister-in-law's murder. Some betrayals cut too deep to heal. The most important lesson I've learned is this: trust your instincts. When something feels wrong, it usually is. When someone's behavior doesn't match their words, believe the behavior. When your gut tells you you're in danger, listen to it. Porter thought he could manipulate me forever, because I'd been conditioned to trust blindly. But the woman who survived his betrayal learned that real strength comes from trusting yourself first, and others only after they've proven themselves worthy of that trust. The hidden phone that revealed his murder plot didn't just save my life, it taught me that I'm capable of surviving anything, fighting back against anyone, and rebuilding from nothing. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for becoming the strongest version of yourself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.